While Jack the Ripper killed perhaps as many as 11 people, H.H. Holmes confessed to killing hundreds. When he was finally caught, newspapers declared him the archfiend, the devil incarnate. But Holmes appeared to be anything but the devil. He was a handsome man in his 20s, a ladies' man, a bit of a dandy, and a shrewd businessman. But he was also a compulsive con artist and the most efficient of all the serial killers past and present, and the most enigmatic of all the serial killers. Holding a medical degree from the University of Michigan, he was, in many ways, the archetypical mad doctor, similar to the serial killer in the 1932 movie thriller, Dr. X. Here we see the serial killer. Dr. X is a white male in his early 30s.
Some friends of mine. May we come in? Of course, gentlemen. Come in.
Intelligent, clever, and like the real-life H.H. Holmes, he is a doctor. He loves the macabre and is particularly fascinated with human body parts.
That's a heart. I've kept it alive for 3 years by electrolysis. Electrolysis? Professor Wells has accomplished some remarkable findings in nerve reflexes. You flatter me, Doctor. Oh, no.
I understand, Professor, that you live just for your work, that you seldom leave the Institute.
Not necessarily. I played truant a short while ago. I was down by the waterfront for a breath of air.
What time was
You're
that?
not feeling well? Your arm is troubling you? Yes, it's very annoying. Well, you're foolish to sit there in discomfort. If you gentlemen don't mind, Why, of course not, of course not. I put it on just as I heard you coming. An empty sleeve is refolding to most people.
Well, I think we have taken up enough of Professor Wells' time.
Oh, not at all, Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, Professor.
Well, gentlemen, shall we be going?
No one could have predicted the bizarre and gruesome turn H.H. Holmes' life would take from his birth. He was born into a wealthy and respected New Hampshire family and given the name Herman Webster Mudgett. But as a young boy, he was constantly bullied. And then came a day when the bullying went too far. His taunters took him to a doctor's office. There, they put the lifeless, bony fingers of a human skeleton upon his face. Far from being horrified, Herman found the experience fascinating, even thrilling. There, his ghoulish interest in human anatomy was born. Herman began by dissecting kittens, dogs, rabbits, any animal he could find.
There are a number of cases involving serial murderers where if you drill deep and look at their own personal histories, what you find is that they themselves have been victims of abuse, sometimes torture, as children, and one of the consequences of that abuse is ultimately the murder of another person. But in between, one often finds evidence of a child who's been a victim of abuse, who for a number of years tortures animals as a way to deal with their own victimization. And the torturing of animals can sometimes evolve over time into the torture, abuse, and ultimately murder of another human being. It is very common to find that perpetrators of serial murder themselves were subjected to horrific abuse as children.
I recently studied the biographies of 54 serial killers, and I looked in their life stories for episodes of animal abuse. And I think it's not surprising that most of them had abused animals when they were children. Of course, so have millions of healthy, decent people. They grow up and out of it. You know, animal abuse when you're 6 or 7 years old is certainly a symptom of powerlessness. But there are many people who grow out of that feeling. Serial killers, for some reason, can't do that. And they don't just abuse animals. Oh, no. Most of them abuse in the cruelest possible manner. Dogs and cats. They maximize the suffering. They do it with their own hands by stabbing and mutilating and dismembering and strangling to death domesticated animals, usually family pets. Indeed, many serial killers rehearse. When they're children, they will use a particular method to abuse animals and inflict cruelty and punishment and pain and suffering, and then they use the same method decades later on their human victims. If they practice bestiality when they're young children, they rape their human victims later. If they stab or strangle the animals, they stab or strangle human beings. So it's a way of rehearsing. It's a way of providing a training ground for these serial killers.
At the age of 18, Herman married Clara Levering, the daughter of a rich local farmer. 1 year later, Herman left rural New Hampshire to attend the University of Michigan Medical School. There, he saw opportunities in the hospital wards and dissection rooms to gain access to corpses for his insurance scams. It was here he gave himself his own nickname, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, H.H. Holmes. His insurance scams were brilliant. Holmes stole cadavers from medical laboratories, disfigured them, planted them where they would be found as accidents, and then claimed they were relatives of the one and only H.H. Holmes. Having previously taken out insurance policies on these fictitious family members, he collected a tidy sum, one in excess of $12,000. At this point, it was fortunate for Clara that she and her infant son returned to New Hampshire and never saw Holmes again. Just as suddenly, Holmes dropped out of sight. He turned up briefly in St. Paul and New York. Then in 1885, at the age of 25, posing as an inventor, Holmes resurfaced in Chicago's north suburban town of Wilmette. Though he had not divorced his first wife, he was now married to Myrtle Z. Belknap, the daughter of a wealthy businessman, a man Holmes had unsuccessfully tried to swindle and kill. It is unknown how many people Holmes may have killed between Michigan and Chicago. Maybe none. Maybe many.
Well, I think the likelihood of Holmes having murdered additional people between his college experience and the beginning of his activities surrounding the World's Fair in Chicago, I think is very high. You know, we're talking about a person who, by the time he came to Chicago, had an elaborate fantasy that he was able to execute in an incredibly complicated and full-blown fashion. It strikes me that that kind of fantasy and the ability to execute that fantasy probably didn't spring into being all complete in Chicago. I think that it's probably very likely that he had additional experiences with murder in between college and the time he came to Chicago.
Holmes' first known killing was a Mrs. E.S. Holton. In 1887, H.H. Holmes began working as an assistant at a local drugstore in Chicago, run by Mrs. E.S. Holton. An older woman who could not handle the trade any longer, she needed assistance. It was not long before Holmes seemed to be more the manager of the store and less the prescription